Climbing My Grandfather by Andrew Waterhouse. So this is a really interesting poem about getting to know your grandfather when it's really too late, if you like. So it's quite a nostalgic poem. It's a narrative verse, a first person trying to recall his past, but written from the present tense. There's a relaxed and conversational tone as the narrator's mind wanders from memory to memory, and the free verse suggests the natural rhythm of speech. Now, there's a single stanza which suggests the size and magnitude of the grandfather. It's kind of like a journey climbing this huge stanza, just like the poetic voice is climbing up his grandfather, metaphorically. No one's actually climbing on anyone in this poem. The themes of nostalgia and loss and memory are really key to this poem. The idea is that at the time when he was younger and he could have got to know his grandfather, words couldn't express those feelings, and he was too young really to express those feelings at the time. And there are very few details of the inner person of the grandfather. It's all really about his outside appearance. So this suggests perhaps a sense of distance in their relationship, that the poetic voice never fully accomplished what they set out to do. They never actually really got to know their grandfather. Okay, so let's have a look at the title. The verb climbing suggests this continual process. That it's not I climbed my grandfather, but it's I'm climbing. I'm still doing it. I'm still getting to know him. And this idea of climbing suggests a real sense of awe as well, that he's like mountainous almost. And talking of mountainous, there's a lot of mountaineering imagery in this poem. The mountaineering extended metaphor is used to try and understand his grandfather. The idea of it being something that's difficult, it's a struggle, it takes skill to do. He's working on that relationship and taking on the challenge. And it compares the grandfather to something impressive, like a mountain, and also creates a sense of enjoyment and purposefulness in climbing him. So let's have a look at the poem itself. Without a rope or net. So going climbing without a rope or net is a very dangerous thing to do, in case you fall, obviously. So there's a clear sense of risk here. He rejects the support that he might need. So because this is all an extended metaphor, the support here is support to kind of jog his memory. So for example, photographs. And it seems like a very adult decision and kind of audacious and daring to go back to a childhood memory without anything to help you along the way. Now the brogues are a kind of shoe, a sturdy, practical kind of shoe, which is very traditional, and these reflect the grandfather, so the shoes represent the man. And they're also dusty and cracked, so they're well used, they've been worn in, a sense of perhaps respect for the hard work that the grandfather did over the course of his life. But there's also this sense of a small child looking up at a towering adult from his feet. So working at the feet and really looking up at this mountain that is his grandfather. There's a lot of verbs throughout the poem which relate to the climbing experience, so pushing, trying. These suggest difficulty and the struggle of this task. So it's a difficult thing to try and do, especially without a rope or a net. Now we move on to the grandfather's hands. He has earth-stained hands and his nails are splintered, with really specific details suggesting that he had quite an intimate knowledge, perhaps, of the grandfather. Also, perhaps the grandfather was somebody who worked outdoors, so there's a respect for that kind of work that men used to do, that work that used to be male work, working outdoors, physical work, with his stained hands and his splintered, cracked fingernails. It could also suggest that the elderly are kind of poorly treated or maybe overlooked and neglected, but they have a lot to give and to offer, because it is his very splintered nails which give good purchase, which help him to climb. To give good purchase means that it makes it easier for you to climb up something. So although they might be splintered, they might be overlooked by other people, they're actually helpful, maybe just like old people. This interesting simile and oxymoron here, that his skin was like warm ice. And I think that that kind of relates to the way in which it's hard to articulate the memories about the grandfather. There's something difficult about the grandfather, difficult to express about him. And that might be because the poetic voice doesn't know him very well, hence this whole process of climbing, or perhaps that they've had a difficult relationship or a distant relationship, and therefore he's not quite sure how to interpret the grandfather. I think it also suggests that although there might be something cold about the grandfather, there's also a warmth within him. He's got these two aspects of his personality. There's a scar on the grandfather's arm, which he puts his feet on gently. So as we know, a scar creates a kind of ridge, and the poet puts his feet on them gently. Now this adverb suggests that he understands and respects the painful aspects of his grandfather's life. So the scar is treated in a gentle manner to reflect that respect for what the grandfather might have gone through. But the grandfather has still firm shoulders. Now these shoulders, everything in the physical description of the grandfather, the shoes, his skin, his shoulders, everything about the description of the grandfather represents the man himself. So quite often with our grandparents, we don't really have heart-to-hearts with them necessarily and get to know the innermost workings of their mind. We go based on their appearances, and everything about the appearances of this grandfather relate to the man itself. So they represent aspects of the grandfather. So the firm shoulder here suggests strength and reliability, perhaps he's trusted, and again respect for this older man, that he really contributed something to society, and he's still firm, he's still got that authority perhaps within him. And then at this point the narrator rests in the shade, and I think that this could suggest that perhaps he felt always in the shadow of his grandfather, or that his grandfather set a very high standard that was kind of hard to live up to. And I think that's particularly interesting after it comes after this description of the firm shoulder, that he has to rest in the shade. Perhaps he can't live up to the man that the grandfather was. And climbing has its dangers. So this is a hint perhaps at grief, and a sense that memory has to be thought about carefully in order to be clear, and suggests that looking too closely at people could reveal the negative traits and spoil our childhood memories. So climbing has its dangers. It's dangerous because we are delving into somebody's character, reflecting on the past, and that can be a very painful experience. Going back over old memories can be painful, perhaps missed opportunities. But also getting to know somebody deeply has dangers because it could throw up unexpected things perhaps that we wouldn't like to know. You know, as a child, we idealise perhaps our grandparents, but as an adult, when we get to know them, perhaps it's just not that straightforward. So then he climbs up the neck and he drinks among the teeth. I've always found this quite a grotesque kind of description, that he drinks the saliva from between the teeth, essentially. But if you kind of get over how kind of gross that sounds, I think it suggests drinking in the wisdom or the words of the grandfather, really absorbing it. If we say we're drinking somebody's words, then we're really absorbing them and paying attention to them. Then we go to the eyes. A pupil slowly opens and closes. Now there's a sense of distance between the person who's climbed and the climber. The granddad is not really aware of him being there, and it's kind of almost a mythical description, almost like a kind of Cyclops description here, this great eye opening and closing, suggesting that the narrator is just this tiny figure climbing up him, not really noticed by the grandfather, not really significant to the grandfather, perhaps creating a sense of sadness there. And the pupil here has a double meaning, because he tries to learn about his grandfather. So obviously it refers to the part of the eye, but it also suggests that the narrator is trying to learn about his grandfather, be a pupil of the grandfather. Again, we're moving further up the grandfather now to his hair, which is thick and white. We really get a sense of mountainous imagery here with a white peak of the mountain and gasping for breath. Again, this description suggests how difficult this process has been, that it's been a real ordeal. And we can see that just throughout the length of this stanza as well, is kind of an ordeal in itself as we climb up the grandfather. And then he watches the clouds and birds circle, and then he gets a sense of the heart, knowing the slow pulse of his good heart. And I think it's really key that we end on this line. It suggests a steady and warm love, slow and regular, and it reflects his good heart, the pulse there. So this definite language, knowing the slow pulse, is very different to the kind of hesitant language we've got at the beginning of the poem, where we were just trying to get a grip. And I think this suggests a sense of achievement and really feeling confident in our understanding of the grandfather, despite all these difficult parts of the grandfather perhaps, despite this sense of ice. I know the pulse of his good heart. Overall, I believe him to be a good person. So we get comforted and reassured. There's a sense of warmth overall. It's not cold and daunting as it was at the beginning. So now that we've climbed the grandfather, we feel much closer to him emotionally. Again, the first indication really of an emotional inner workings of the grandfather at the end, and that makes us feel more positive about him. So the symbolism of mountains suggests an obstacle and yet also something immovable and constant. Mountains are often symbols of this steadfast, solid, reliable force. Perhaps they're distant and isolated, but they're also reliable and strong. And I think all of these different connotations of mountains can help us to understand the grandfather in this poem.